All right, that's my cue. It's 11 a.m., so we'll get started with today's webinar. My name is Kristen, and from all of us on David's team, I just want to thank you as always and extend a heartfelt thank you for committing to spend the time with us today. We know how busy you all are, and it's not always easy to take this time and step away, but we're really confident that today's session on accountability will have a real and lasting impact on your leadership and your life. Speaking from my own experience, David's teachings on accountability are something I'm so incredibly grateful for and am mindful of daily. Incorporating the lessons have made a big difference in how I approach and experience different scenarios at work and at home. For anyone that's joining us for the first time, I just want to take a quick moment to share a little bit about David. David has more than 35 years of experience as a family therapist, workshop facilitator, lecturer, and advisor to leadership executives from all over the world. He is a best-selling author. He quite literally wrote the book on accountability, respected thought leader, and sought-after speaker. David's just so passionate about helping leaders lead better, and these monthly webinars are just one of the many ways that David's able to share his message and his knowledge with as many people as possible. So thank you again for being here today, and thank you for being a part of this incredible, diverse community. It's always so exciting and encouraging to see leaders from all over Canada and beyond, from every line of work and stages of their life and career, with the common bond of wanting to show up as the best versions of themselves. So without further ado, here is David.
Thank you, Kristen. Thank you, everybody. And Kristen, if we looked up accountability in the dictionary, your name would be in there. So totally, your accountability inspires me. Thank you, everybody, for coming. And I just want to reiterate, please use the chat room. We've got people from really all over the world. And please use the chat room. Let us know where you're from and anything about yourself. And feel free as we go through this presentation to react to any of the content and have a conversation. I'm really just here in this next hour to shift some of your thinking and to get you talking about accountability in perhaps some new ways. Right off the bat, I want to just say I want to be very transparent about this. One of our main reasons for having these monthly webinars is to let you know about our Authentic Leadership Academy and our new SAGE forums, which I'm just so proud to be introducing to the marketplace and to the world. But if this will likely be our last virtual 3-day academy next week. And so what we're going to be doing is switching them to Banff. It'll be a beautiful venue, but it will obviously be a greater investment to have people there in person. So this will be our last opportunity to have this. We'll have people from around all across Canada and beyond. We've got a few extra seats. So if they're still available. If you're interested, stick around till the end of the 90 minutes. I'm going to talk for an hour, and then we've got a half an hour of dialogue. And if you stick around to the very end, we'll give you a promo code, and we'll also give away one complimentary seat to the Academy. All right, let's move ahead. We're going to take you on a journey. Everybody knows me, knows that I hope this isn't just a presentation with a bunch of content, that I hope it will also be a journey for you. We're going to do 4 things today. We're really going to just cover the 4 pillars of accountability, and this will be intertwined in all of my presentation today. First of all, we're going to talk about clarity. Ambiguity, we're going to shift you from ambiguity to precision. Ambiguity, folks, is a formula for mediocrity. In fact, if you want a formula for frustration, just be ambiguous. And this is something that's paramount in accountability. You're going to learn that precision is the name of the game here. Get really, really precise around expectations, around what we need to support each other, around consequences. This lies at the heart of accountability. We're going to talk about personal accountability, which is shifting from being a consumer to being a citizen. And I want to tell you, if you want to build an accountable organization and create an accountable organization, hire citizens, don't hire consumers. And for some of you, it's a little late, but you can still begin to really hone in on your hiring process and make sure you're hiring citizens, not consumers. It's a whole lot easier to foster accountability with citizens than it is with consumers. And I'll explain what I mean as we go on. Number 3, we're going to talk about partnerships, shifting your employees from being an employee to being an owner. And again, it's a whole lot easier if you can hire owners rather than hire employees and shift them, but it's not impossible. And then finally, agreements. We're going to talk about moving from expectations into results. So that's your agenda for the next hour. And then we'll have a good discussion and dialogue afterwards, if you can stick around for the last half an hour. First of all, I'm going to start with an accountability agreement with you. I better practice what I preach here. So I'm going to give you, this is what I'm going to promise. We're going to make this relevant, engaging, and real. I'm going to make accountability inspiring. People tend not to get inspired by accountability, and my job is to make it inspiring. Be open for feedback and to learn. I'm not here to fix anything, but to grow. The accountability tends to be a process for fixing problems. And my whole premise is that it's about growing, not fixing. We're talking about downstream problems versus upstream solutions. And so what we want to be doing here is to give you a formula so that we can prevent the solution downstream. If you're frustrated and annoyed, as we all have been with the lack of accountability on our teams, the solution is to move upstream and say, where did I miss the lead indicators rather than paying attention to the lag indicators? Anyway, we'll get to that in a minute. Be respectful and create a safe place to learn, and have time for questions and dialogue to apply the learning. That's what my promise is to you folks. What I ask back, which is my support requirements, is bring an open mind and a heart, extend trust, and challenge me and be direct. I'm not real open for criticism, but I'm hoping that we'll create enough trust here that you might challenge me in the Q&A and the dialogue afterwards. And the consequences, which is we will leave with a renewed perspective on accountability and an increased awareness of how it impacts every aspect of your work and your life. You'll leave with a better understanding of personal responsibility that will lead to a more meaningful and fulfilling life, will lead to increased skills at preventing frustrations upstream, and will leave with a practical accountability process that will help you get a grip on results while ensuring personal and organizational excellence and satisfaction. So what I've just given you here is a little accountability agreement. This is what I'm going to promise. This is what I need back. And this is the consequences that we're going to have as a result of our work together. So I hope that that's what I promise. All right. Let me just give you, before I get into the content of the 4 pillars of accountability, I want to just give you a little bit of backstory. So my background actually is in family therapy. I was a family therapist in Lethbridge back in back in the whole 80s. I had my own private practice. Very interesting when you're a family therapist, nobody ever brings in their good kids. But what I did was I started to do talks for parents, because by the time you fix, but it's a downstream problem by the time they end up in a therapist's office so often. And I'm just putting a Band-Aid on an artery wound, it felt like. So I started to do presentations to parents back in the 80s on raising accountable kids. And what happened was I ended up getting business executives coming to my parenting talks and saying, would you present the same material to our executive team? We could use this. I had no clue what I was doing. I went into organizations. I'm a family guy, and I went into organizations and just told them what I'd learned about families, and it landed. And I got so busy working in organizations, I gave up my family therapy practice in 1989, moved to Calgary, went into business with these 2 guys. We wrote a book together called Accountability: Getting a Grip on Results. They had collectively about 40 years of experience in working with accountability inside the oil patch. They helped me understand the business side. It was my philosophy. We wrote this book. It was their tool. It was their process, and it was my philosophy. We combined this together, and we had a blast in the 1990s on this whole notion of accountability. This is really what took off where my career took off. My big claim to fame is that we sold 80,000 copies of these to an oil company in Russia. Luke Oil bought 80,000. We translated into Russian. And if you were in Calgary in the 90s and worked for any of the top 10 oil companies, you'd have used our accountability process. But where we began to separate from these 2 partners, I still have great respect for Bruce and Sean. Where we began to separate is that I started to do some research in the early 2000s around what people want from their leaders. And it was turning into a very transactional process. I mean, you can use this process for, getting rid of any performance review system and adapt this, or you can adapt this to whatever performance or system you have. So this is what we taught, but it became a very transactional, check the box exercise. And I thought there's got to be more than this. And my heart started to open up around saying, it's got to be more than just this transactional exercise. So in my research, what I discovered is that what we want from leaders is we want leaders to get past the fads and the gimmicks and the flavors of the month. We just want our leaders to be real. So my work was then to begin to integrate accountability into this whole notion of authenticity. And that's when I met this guy named Jim Rieger, who has registered for this call. I hope he's on the call and we can introduce him afterwards. Many of you met him in our last webinar, but he and I wrote this book on Bridges of Trust, which integrates accountability into authenticity. And, accountability without authenticity is drudgery, but authenticity without accountability is fantasy. And it's when we combine these together that we really create unstoppable organizations. And that's what I've been passionate about. And then my most recent book integrates all of my material and beyond. So that's where I come from. But I come from a very, my background around all this is still working with kids and working with families. So the whole notion of integrating accountability with authenticity is to recognize this, that authenticity is the fruit and accountability is the root. Now, obviously, we're going to spend time talking about accountability today. It's not the sexy part of our work. None of us want on our headstone when we're at the end of our lives to be remembered for being accountable. Well, I mean, it's a nice quality to have, but it's a process of living that is a means to a much higher end. It's like a house. You walk into a beautiful house, the accountability is like the foundation. You don't focus on, unless you build foundations, you don't focus on walking into a beautiful house and focus on how beautiful how solid the foundation is. But if you don't have a foundation, you don't have a house. If you don't have good, strong roots, you don't have authenticity. So it's really the roots of our life and our work. When we talk about trust, anybody's been through any of my workshops know that it's a belief in and it's a reliance upon. There's a relational component to trust, and there's an accountability component to trust. And so what we're going to focus on today is the accountability. But I want to really say anything that I talk about today, remember this: connect before you expect. Make sure you don't just adapt any of these processes and philosophy into your work as a leader without first connecting. Otherwise, it'll just be a transaction. And so the whole notion here is accountability without connection is compliance and drudgery. It's just that I'm going to extract the connection component out to focus on the accountability piece. Everybody interacts, but very few people connect. So make sure that you're not just walking into a system and adapting this accountability process when you don't have the foundation of relationships. Another way to say this is that leadership is based on really two things: supporting people, but also pushing people. And by the way, this is parenting 101, right? Don't support people when they need to be pushed, but don't push people when they need to be supported. And it's a continual balancing act here. Now, we're going to talk about the push part today. And what you're going to learn here is it's actually not a push at all when you get really clear. All right. On that note, let's start with the 4 pillars of accountability. Let's start with clarity. First of all, let me give you a definition of accountability. You are welcome to borrow my definition. You're welcome to use it. I don't care what definition you use. Make sure that you, whatever system, whatever team, whatever family you're operating from, if you're going to talk about, we're going to be more accountable here, make sure you all understand what you mean and all are on the same page. Everybody talks about accountability. Kids should be more accountable. Teachers should be more accountable. Politicians should be more accountable. Leaders should be more accountable. We talk about it, folks, as if we understand what we're talking about, and we don't. So what I learned on the farm growing up is that you can shake a hand and say, you can count on me. It has nothing to do with blame. In fact, if you're blaming, it indicates that you haven't had accountability to begin with. As Henry Ford said, you can't build a reputation on what you're going to do. So if we had time today, I'd have you make a list of everybody in your life that you can count on and reflect on what it's like to be around those people. Now consider, whose list would you earn the right to be on? If I were to ask the people who depend on you to be put on, would you be on their list? It's a whole lot easier, folks, to see a lack of accountability in other people than it is to see it in ourselves. It's a whole lot easier to be frustrated with our dentist when she's 20 minutes late than it is to be frustrated with ourselves. Hey, when have I kept someone waiting? Now consider whose list would you be on, and reflect on ways that you want to consider showing greater appreciation for those people in your life who are accountable. Here's my notion: catch people being accountable. If you want to be accountable, you want to build an accountable culture, you'll get a whole lot better return on your investment if you do it with a flashlight rather than a stick. Walk around your organization and catch people being accountable. I learned this from WestJet years ago, back when they had a great culture back in the 90s. They never started an operational meeting without a story. So if you want to build an accountable philosophy on your team, set a time for every operational meeting. Take a moment, just like you have a safety moment, have an accountability moment. Hey, where was somebody accountable on our team in the last week? Shine a light on it. Clarify, acknowledge, and celebrate it. Okay, so that's the first thing, is just to start to do it in a very positive way. Now, where did we all learn to be accountable? I can't talk about accountability without acknowledging my parents. Back in that generation, they use words like maturity, initiative, and duty. Where did we learn to be accountable? Now, where were the seeds of accountability first planted in you? You would not be here today. You showed up today. You're accountable. You made a promise to yourself, and you showed up. You made a promise to me, and you showed up. Where did you first learn how to be accountable? We are not born accountable, born authentic, but folks, we have to learn how to be accountable. How was that taught to you? This is my mother's first husband, second from the right, Ted Harling. This team of pilots were flying penicillin into Poland. This is 5 minutes before they got on that plane. Plane never came back. So in that generation, we have been, we've got in Canada here, upcoming Remembrance Day. In that generation, we were given the perspective and the philosophy of duty and sacrifice and selfless service, working for the greater good, loyalty, grit. These are all qualities of what I would call today accountability, showing up in the world, whether you feel like it or not, because it's your duty. These words typically aren't politically correct to use today, but these are the roots of our life, not just the roots of our organization. My mother grew up in this house 6 miles outside of Lethbridge here in southern Alberta. 12 kids were raised in that shack, 2 of whom died in childhood. There wasn't an ounce of entitlement in my mom's bones. In fact, I always say, if you want to raise accountable kids, poverty really helps. My mother always used to say, always make your gratitude bigger than your circumstances. There was no entitlement in her, wasn't in her DNA. There was a sense of gratitude for everything she had. So this is talking about that, modeling this accountability philosophy. Here's the 6 things I learned from my parents. Don't ever make a promise you don't intend to keep. See, all blame is a waste of time. The day that you decide that all blame is a waste of time will be the day that your life will change forever. Waiting, blaming, and annoyance are not effective strategies. We all get annoyed. You know, it's an interesting thing. My computer wasn't working the other day. And so I did what every self-respecting computer person is I pounded on the keyboard harder. I just pounded harder. Just like when I get frustrated with people on my team who aren't measuring up to my expectations, I just push harder. Well, these are not good strategies. If you notice yourself waiting for someone to change, by the way, this is marriage counseling 101, waiting or blaming or getting annoyed, these you will find are not good strategies for fostering accountability. I'm going to give you an alternative to those strategies as we go along here. Nobody but you cares about the reason why you let someone down. You can give all kinds of reasons, but the bottom line is nobody cares if you let somebody down. Turn off the lights when you leave. You know, we didn't stay in too many hotels growing up. We didn't have a lot of money, but when we did, my dad made it a point, turn off the lights. When we walked through the park, the city park, he'd pick up the garbage, own it. Do more than you get paid for. The most important contributions you'll make is won't come with a paycheck in your life. And the most meaningful contribution that you make in the world, the most meaningful thing you do in your life probably aren't going to be the things you get paid for. Ask any parent on this call or any aunt or uncle who looks after kids. All right. So that's the clarity about what we mean by accountability. And again, the thing is, walk around your organization and really clarify with people, what do we actually mean by accountability? You can come up with whatever definition that you'd like. Now we're going to talk about personal responsibility as a component to accountability. Personal accountability and responsibility implies this: the difference between a consumer and a citizen. A consumer is an approach to life that believes that our needs are satisfied by other people's action. A citizen is one who, rather than waiting for or expecting others to meet their needs, they choose to be answerable for the well-being of the whole. Accountable people will say, you know what? I see a lack of accountability around me, but I'm going to show up and I am going to model. I'm the way. I'm going to be the light. I'm going to be accountable, even if no one else around me is accountable. I'm not going to get blaming. This is what happens, is that we blame people who are blaming, and it just cycles down rather than saying, I'm going to be a citizen. I'd be very interested in how you hire citizens and how you measure this. Now that's, this is not a presentation on hiring, but I would be very interested in a hiring process. And if anybody's interested, you can certainly contact me and we can talk about the process of hiring. We are going to talk a little bit here about hiring for values rather than hiring for skills, and hiring for attitude and how you do that. But I'm getting ahead of myself. Bottom line is, look at how I find it very fascinating that we call this a consumer society, that we wait for other people, the government, the leaders, we complain. This is what happens with consumers, is that we complain and blame from a consumer mentality versus a citizen, which says, I'm going to create my own vision here, and I'm going to have the courage to live that vision in spite of perhaps what might be perceived as a lack of accountability around me. Do you want to build accountability, folks? Look in the mirror. It starts with you. Let it begin with you. I love this quote by George Bernard Shaw, the great Irish playwright. This is the true joy of life, the being used for a purpose, recognized by yourself as a mighty one, the being a force of nature instead of a feverish, selfish little clod of ailments and grievances, complaining that the world will not devote itself to making you happy. My parents would have loved this guy. So are you a force of nature in your organization? Start by looking in the mirror. It's a whole lot easier to look around you to see a lack of accountability than it is to look in the mirror and say, hey, listen, am I a force of nature here? Am I part of the problem by my blaming and complaining? Okay. So here's 7 steps to personal responsibility through accountability. Number 1, take 100% responsibility without excuses. What that means is you're not blaming yourself and you're not blaming anybody else. You're saying, I'm going to look at my side of the street. I'm going to take 100% responsibility for saying what needs to happen here. Turn all expectation conversations into clear agreements. Now, here's the deal. There's 3 kinds of conversations in life. I'm probably oversimplifying this, but if you stop and think about any conversation, come in one of 3 categories. Number 1, it's an enjoyable. You just have an enjoyable conversation with someone. Number 2, you have it's a learning conversation where we're actually learning something together. Number 3, it's an expectation conversation. And the key in life, the key in accountability is every time you have an expectation conversation. In other words, if you're having a conversation with someone where there's an expectation, have a clear agreement that goes along with that expectation. Never end an expectation conversation without an agreement. And this is where we're beginning to plant seeds for the upstream work, is did you get an agreement? So for example, let's suppose that you send somebody, a request is not an agreement. Just because you send somebody an email and say, I'd like this project done, you might be thinking Friday, they might be thinking, well, I'll get to it when I can, sometime next week or the week after, whenever I can fit it in. You can't label them as unaccountable until you have an agreement that they didn't keep. You have to have an agreement. Without an agreement, you can't have accountability, and don't use accountability as a stick to beat people up that you don't like or that you don't appreciate their performance. They have to very clearly make a promise and not keep the promise in order to be called unaccountable. So turn all expectation conversations into clear agreements. Reclarify a mutual understanding of the agreement. So this is back in my day, I'm old school here. We used to call them confirming memos, and we would either fax after a conversation that we had. If it was an expectation conversation, you'd get a memo, either usually faxed to you, or you would even put it in the mail back in my day. But that's the purpose of emails. It's so easy today. After you've had a conversation with a customer, with a client, with a colleague, with a person on your team, just write a little email. This is what we agreed to. I agreed to have it done by this time. This is what you agreed to do. This is my understanding of the agreement. Did I get the agreement correct? And so many downstream problems with accountability means we just kind of were vague and ambiguous about what we expected upstream. And then they didn't meet our expectation. And we got to take ownership for that. If someone downstream's not meeting my expectation, I have to pay very close attention to how clear was I? Did I get an agreement? Now, an agreement always involves a time frame. Can I have this by this date? Now, I would let your team know if you're going to sharpen the accountability tool, you're going to sharpen the saw on accountability. Let your team know I'm going to be a bit of a pain in the you know what today, these days, because I'm practicing sharpening up my end of the bargain on accountability. And so it's going to feel a little redundant. It's going to feel a little rigid. But when I hand you something, I'm going to ask you, could I expect you? Can I count on you to get this done for me by 4 o'clock on Friday? Can I count on that? Because I want to really practice sharpening up my agreements. Now, once you get sharpened with your agreements, it'll flow naturally. But in the beginning, it's important to have those agreements clarified. Think carefully before you make an agreement. Now, this works in response then. Do I have the willingness, the resources, and the ability to make this agreement? If you set up a system where just because I'm the boss, you have to keep your agreement, you have to meet my expectations, and I don't give you room to really reflect on that agreement, I am going to inadvertently create frustration and low self-respect for you, because you're going to learn that keeping your agreements is the foundation of self-respect in life. And so you want to make sure that you make room for having dialogues. Now, this is crossing into my whole notion around turning employees into partners, but it begins with giving people permission to negotiate their agreements. And if you don't give people an opportunity to say, no, I can't make that agreement, then you're not going to be able to trust their yes. Now, maybe it means that they have to keep their agreement with you to have this project done. That's very important. It's a high priority in your time frame. Then maybe you need to negotiate something that they could take out of their schedule to make room for this new agreement that you're asking from them. But don't just keep piling stuff on. This is what's burning us out, is that we don't think carefully about these agreements. We just expect, well, I got to keep my job, so I got to do what I'm asked to do. And this is a formula for burnout, not to mention disrespect for ourselves. Only make agreements that you know you will honor. Never make a promise that you aren't able to keep and that you know you won't keep. Write agreements down. I got to tell you, I'm old school. I still carry this little black book around me. And every time I make an agreement, the agreement gets written in my little black book. And then at the end of the day, it gets transferred into my day timer so that it's scheduled in there. I have to write it down. And part of that's my age as I'm getting along here. I got to remember stuff, but it was ingrained in me early on to write agreements down. Okay. Be impeccable about keeping promises, whether it's keeping a promise to get up and exercise with yourself, a promise to yourself to get up and exercise. My dad would say it's mind over mattress. Once you've made a promise, it's not negotiable. You keep it whether you feel like it or not. That's why you think carefully. If you want to get up and exercise in the morning, I'm not telling you to exercise in the morning, but if you want to keep your integrity at 9 o'clock at night, when you make that promise, don't evaluate at 6 o'clock in the morning when you're rolling off around in bed. Well, should I or shouldn't I? No, that's not the time to negotiate with yourself whether you're going to keep that promise. You made a promise. It doesn't matter how you feel, you keep it. Now, having said that, you have to have a recovery process. Let's face it, life happens. We had a team member just this week who said, I can't show up for my team meeting because of an urgent situation with his family. And you know what? He let us know. He had a recovery process where he let us know early on, gave us lots of lead time. And it is very understandable given this individual's circumstance, that what he's dealing with right now. So we need to have a recovery process. Here's my recovery process. Let your creditor know as soon as you know if your agreement has been jeopardized. Negotiate with your creditor at this point to minimize damages and recommit to a new agreement, and learn from your experience so that it doesn't happen again. But you know what? As long as we're learning, then we grow. Okay, then we get wiser. All right, you want a respectful, inspired culture? Here's where it starts. It starts with accountability, because accountability is keeping a promise. And by the way, this is true whether you keep a promise to yourself to get up and exercise, or show up for your daughter's soccer game, or show up as a parent, or show up in a meeting, or show up on a project. That will lead to integrity. And integrity leads to self-respect. We all have had the experience of dragging our feet out of bed in the morning, whether you feel like it or not, and you get up and you do your exercise, you go for a walk, I don't care what it is, and you get this feeling of self-respect an hour later because you kept your promise to yourself. And we say it's the endorphins from the exercise. I suggest that there's endorphins that come from integrity. I had no idea the power of this to help me with my own mental health challenges when I began to learn about accountability. I mean, all the seeds were planted when I was a kid, but when I began to, there's no better way to learn something than to teach it. Spent 10 years teaching accountability to companies, and I began to integrate these ideas about keeping promises to myself. I'll tell you, it had so much positive impact on my mental health. We have taken this whole process of keeping a promise to yourself. Just notice how it will impact your own mental health. If you have a propensity to getting depressed, let me give you the formula for getting depressed is, because I know this from my own experience, just live your life and how you feel. And you'll be depressed. You'll be so depressed. You know, you don't feel like going to work, don't go to work. Just do what's easy in life. And I'll tell you, that's a formula for mental illness if you have a propensity to getting depressed, versus the opposite, which is to say, you know what? It doesn't matter how you feel. What matters is you made a promise. Maybe next time you'll make a different promise, but for now, you know what? You're going to keep that promise. And maybe you'll say, you know what? Maybe you'll say at 9 o'clock at night, I need more rest than I need extra. Then sleep in and keep your self-respect, but don't break your promise midstream. It diminishes your integrity, which diminishes self-respect. The opposite is the case. Accountability leads to integrity, leads to self-respect, and then you get respect from others, and that's what builds a respectful, inspired culture. I spend about 20 hours a week working with addicts and in my volunteer time. And I'll tell you something, what addicts have taught me is when you're recovering from alcohol addiction, you're not necessarily just recovering from alcohol addiction, you're recovering your integrity, because when you're caught in the grips of addiction, you have no integrity. You know, you wake up in the morning and says, oh, I'm going to not drink today. 4 o'clock in the afternoon, you're drunk. Well, you got no self-respect, and you can't have any respect from other people because you're caught in that grip of addiction. You create a program for yourself that says, I'm not going to drink today, and I've got a whole system to keep me sober, and I'm going to honor that. That at the end of the day, you earn self-respect because you live with integrity. Don't be afraid of this notion of accountability. It's the foundation and roots of our life. We're not going to get into this today, but I do talk in my lengthier programs about the victim box. We all get into the victim box. We all get into renting our lives instead of owning our lives. You ever hear this? It's not my job. I'm just renting it. Well, own it. Take an ownership for it. And we all get in when we're under stress. We all get into the victim box as a way of as a defense against the courage to make some changes in our life. And so just begin to notice. And what we do when I come in and work with a whole team is that we create a charter, a team charter around challenging ourselves to get out of the victim box. And so, you know, we create a dialogue around, so it's not just up to the boss, the positional leader, to keep you out of the victim box. We keep ourselves. In fact, our kids, I tell you, our kids were raised getting out of the victim box. If they ever came home and complained about a teacher, my response always was, listen, I'm not an English teacher, but I know enough about English. When my kids would come home and say, oh, my teacher sucks, I would say to them, I'm not an English teacher, but I know enough about English to realize sucking is not an adjective. Sucking is a verb. So I said, what exactly do they suck from? And so it would drive my kids crazy. But you know what? they learn that I'm not going to tolerate living in the victim box. And then they'd bring friends over and say, oh, my teacher sucks. And my kids would look at it, don't go there, Dad. You're not going to get any response. You're not going to get any support from my dad. Anyway, I was complaining about my travel schedule this fall. And my daughter was telling me, Dad, it's, we were having this conversation. Her and I do this podcast together. And she said, Dad, it sounds like you're in the victim box. So you know what? They got it. My 29-year-old challenged me. So you know what? When for those of you who are parents or aunts or uncles, influence kids, when you have gotten your message across to your kids, when your kids teach you what you were trying to teach them. Anyway, so that's personal responsibility. Now let me talk about partnerships and how do you turn your employees into partners. This is all part of the energy process for building energetically accountability. Before you get to the agreement process, which is where we're going to finish off here, make sure you're looking at the mindset that you bring to that relationship, but also the mindset of that relationship. So here's my premise, folks. We have an outdated parental, patriarchal employment contract that we have been operating from probably since the Industrial Revolution. And it comes from a parent-child relationship. And the parent-child relationship there's a contract in any parent-child relationship. I'll play nice, you take care of me. I'll be a good child, and the boss, you be a good parent. You look after me, and I'll play along, okay? Now, here's what it looks like. Here's the outdated contract. If you do as you're told, score high on your performance evaluations, be available 24/7, do your job plus somebody else's, are loyal, we will give you a job. We'll give you job security until we can't. We'll give you a competitive salary and benefits. We'll provide an evaluation of 1 to 10 of how pleased we are with you, offer you promotional opportunities, and we'll take care of you. And that is the parental contract. Now, first of all, job security. As long as you're expecting your boss to give you job security, you are operating from a child perspective. It is never a boss's job to give you job security. Your job security has to come from within. And see, when will we have the courage when we hire people to say, you know what, we're not going to give you job security here. Your job security is your employability. You might want to go and get some job interviews every once in a while to know that we want to earn your loyalty here, but we don't do it by giving you job security because we've never been able to in the beginning anyway. So I'm not saying you go around and fire people inadvertently or lay people off, but I'm saying watch the parental contract in all of our interactions with each other. I'm proposing here is that we move from a parent-child relationship where we evaluate and grade and punish and move to an adult-to-adult relationship. What that means is this is the partnering relationship. If you clarify expectations and mutual agreements, create value and deliver agreed upon results, keep your promises, keep learning and growing, take responsibility for your own security by being employable, we will clarify expectations and mutual agreements, ensure a safe place to work in without job security, keep our promises, co-create with you a remarkable culture, co-create a space for you to contribute and to grow and to bring your whole self to work. It's subtle, but it's also an entirely different kind of contract that we have. We're two mutual, we might have, when you get promoted, you don't get a promotion. What you get is a whole new job. And what you get is more accountability. You don't get more power. Anybody understands this. Anybody that's been promoted on this call understands that a promotion doesn't give you more power. It does give you more accountability. And we're going to talk about that in a minute. You do have more of an ownership, but that doesn't mean that you have power over or that you're a parent. It just simply means that you have a responsibility to make sure those expectations are clear. Now, what the parental contract does is security comes from outside of yourself. You have to make me secure. You have to take care of me. You have to be a good boss. By the way, it reinforces the consumer mindset that it's up to somebody else to take care of you. It breeds entitlement, it breeds blame, it breeds a culture of complaint, and it breeds regression toward adolescence. I don't know how many of you have ever seen your team turn into kids, blaming and regressing back to being a child. It's self-centered, and politics are paramount. In the partnering relationship, security comes from within. It's creating a safe and caring place. Ownership, and by the way, that is on a positional leader to create a safe place. And anybody knows me knows that I talk very strongly about psychological safety. That is on the employer. That's on the positional leader to create a safe place and to co-create a caring place. Ownership and personal responsibility. We all have a personal responsibility to contribute to this culture as partners in the leadership process. Service over self-interest, high trust, energy and engagement, and minimal politics. Now, let's talk about the performance management within the parental system versus the partnering system. Number one, it's a one way. I'm going to evaluate you. If there's one thing that you learned from this presentation, is stop giving your employees numbers on the evaluation form. You can ask for a number. You can say, rate me on a scale of 1 to 10, how I'm doing as a leader, but don't rate other people. Why does that not work? Well, let me tell you, it's a child perspective. It goes back to high school. It goes back to grade school when we brought home a report card and I'm trying to please my boss. I'm trying to please my parent, or I'm not. But it comes from a parental perspective. Let me ask you this. Anything that you're doing with your employees, would you go home and do it with your spouse or significant other? Would you go home and evaluate your spouse? Find out how long that's going to work for you to go home and rate your spouse on a scale of 1 to 10 on how he or she is doing in the relationship. Well, if you wouldn't do it with a spouse, folks, why on earth would you do it with one of your team members? This is not about appraising. This is not about evaluating people. What I'll tell you what to replace that with. But just be aware of how much parental mindset is ingrained in our systems, and it results in complaints and punishment. It involves fixing people. We're going to straighten you out. It's an annual thing, and I'm going to hold you accountable. Well, what a partnership model is that it's two ways. It's honest, respectful feedback. It's saying, you know what? I'm not going to let poor behavior I'm not going to tolerate poor behavior. I have an accountability to nail and to nail poor behavior and to say this is unacceptable and there's consequences to continue this behavior. Catch it early. I'm not saying that a partnering relationship is just being nice to people. It's hard. It's hard work to be clear about your expectations and then to be clear about consequences. But it does mean that that you also own it. Listen, your staff can be hard on you and that you can be hard on each other. And this is how we foster mutual growth. There's growth opportunities. There's consequences. You fit people. Don't fix people. You fit people. It's ongoing, and we hold each other accountable. Now, again, you've got, as a positional leader, you've got an extra responsibility to make sure that people adhere to some principles and practices that are within the culture. You're not abdicating that responsibility, but it's a partnership approach. Okay, now that's my partnership, and hopefully that there will be some discussion afterwards for people to stay. Now, finally, what loops all of this together is having a good, clear agreement process. And this is an upstream process so that you can avoid downstream conversations. Now, granted, you'll sometimes still have downstream conversations, but this is the crux of those upstream upstream conversations. So this is Colin Powell, who said that everyone on a team knows who is not performing, and they're looking to you as a leader to see what you're going to do about it. This is one of your agreements. One of your accountabilities as a positional leader is that you have to recognize who is not performing, and it's up to you to do something about that. So Dave Keys, I hope you're on the call. My good friend Dave Keys gave me this from the US Navy perspective, 3 main reasons why people fail to perform as expected. It really comes down to 3 reasons. Number 1, they're unaware of the expectations. Don't expect people to perform as expected if you don't give them clear expectations. They lack the required skill or they choose not to. So what is the accountability of a positional leader in these 3 cases? Number 1, leaders, if they're unaware of the expectations, then leaders are accountable to communicate those expectations. If there's a lack of skill or capacity, leaders are accountable to assess through conversation and through observation workplace competencies and ensure adequate resources are available. If you're expecting somebody to do something and you're not providing them the resources to do that, folks, you are creating a system that erodes their self-respect. And if you're eroding self-respect, you're eroding their integrity, you're eroding their energy. And then they choose not to. So as leaders, you're accountable to ensure that you have the right people on your team and to ensure maybe there's a poor fit here. Now, the same thing is true when you're taking a look at this through the eyes of a colleague, when you may not have positional leadership, but you've got a colleague where you have expectations. You're accountable to communicate those expectations. You're accountable to assess willingness, capability, and resources, and then work together at helping them find those resources. And you're accountable for the well-being of the greater good, to depend on the reliable people and to assess honestly if this is the right culture for you. So you might say, well, there's certain people here I can't count on. There's consequences to that. If this doesn't work out, then you know what? I may decide to learn from this and I may decide to move on. But I'm not going to waste any of my time complaining about it. I'm going to take the action that's required. Okay. So let me give you the agreement process. Now, again, we've been teaching this essentially this agreement process for 25 years. You can change the words. I don't care. But if you see a breakdown in accountability, in other words, if you're annoyed, if you're frustrated downstream, chances are something was amiss upstream. There was something that in one of these 5 points was not adequately explained and understood mutually. So the first point in any agreement is to get clarity. And the clarity involves 3, but first of all, you get clarity, then you get an agreement. And the agreement says, can I count on you to do this? You sink the nail with a clear agreement. Support requirements. Are people clear what supports they need to keep that agreement? Your support requirements are your accountabilities to the person you depend on. Their support requirements to you are their accountabilities to you. This is what nails us together in an integrated accountability agreement. Consequences. Now, you always start with positive consequences. We can talk more about consequences in the dialogue afterwards, but you always start with positive consequences, assuming that you're going, like I did at the beginning of this, assuming that we are going to keep our agreements. These are the positive consequences that turn into motivators that you can use as motivators through a negotiated process. And then how often do we need to meet in order to assure that our agreements to each other are kept? So you have support agreements from me. I'm going to give you some support, but I may not be meeting your expectations. You may not be meeting my expectations. Let's start with meeting every week and we'll assess that as we go along. So that's in a nutshell what the agreement process is. Now, let me break it down, and I particularly want to spend some time on clarity, because clarity is at the foundation of all agreements. So let's start with operational, and then there's 3 kinds of clarity. There's operational clarity, fit clarity, and attitudinal clarity, making sure we get the right attitude. So here's operational clarity. First of all, what you're doing is when you sit down with your team member, you're building a fence together, and within that fence are the expectations on the operational results that you expect. And it is crystal clear. Now, it has to be crystal clear. Now, what I find, even we're forming our own team here as we move into various service lines as an organization. And what I'm finding is, you know what, I had expectations. Now I have to go back with one of my team members particularly, and I have to regroup and I have to reset those expectations. I wasn't clear right up front. And so I got frustrated and I become frustrated. Now I got to step back and take responsibility to go back and say, you know what, I wasn't clear about what my expectations were. So I got to sit back. And then what we do is that we build this fence. And what my job is, so if this is a team member that I have here on my, my team, that's what a team member is, obviously. A team member here, I stay out of their fence. We build this fence together, and then we put them in the corral, and then we say, you know what, you're on your own. But what we'll do is we'll monitor it, maybe once a week. We'll sit down together and say, how are you doing? Are you getting the support that you need? Are you getting the clarity that you need? Are you getting the resources that you need? How am I doing? How are you doing? And let's continue to work at talking about building what's in that fence. But while you're within that corral, I'm staying out of it as a boss. I'm staying out of it and trusting with the guidelines that we've established together, you manage your own results. You manage it because that's the results that you're promising. If you're not meeting my expectations, I'll let you know. If I'm not meeting your expectations, you let me know. And we could also agree, you know what, we'll have a formal meeting about that once a week, but we can call each other at any time and have those conversations. All right, now let's assess fit to make sure that there's a right fit there. And I'm giving you very general, and by the way, there's really three levels of accountability. There's personal accountability, there's relational accountability, and then there's organizational accountability. And I really meant to say at the beginning, we're really focused here on personal accountability and relational accountability. When it comes to, I've got some thoughts about organizational accountability, and I've got some team members that really focus on the organizational accountability. If you want to instigate this within your system, give me a call and we'll help you do that. But it starts with these first two, personal and relational accountability. So that's the first thing, is get clear about operational expectations. Then you got to get clear about fit. Now, what do we mean by fit? And I learned this from Jim Rieger, is that when we hire people, we hire them for two reasons. We hire them for skills and we hire them for attitude. But most of us don't focus on the attitude. What we do is that we focus on the skills, particularly in a labor shortage. Now, next webinar, I'm going to talk about how to engage people in keep people and retain people and attract the best talent in a labor shortage. We're going to talk about that next time. But for today, what I want to just focus on is the fact that we focus on skills. What do we hire for skills, and how many of you have fired or wanted to fire on attitude? We have not done a good job. Now, if you begin to look at this, role models are people who have high skills and the right attitude. Kristen and Marg on this call are on our team are total role models for how they live, their attitude and their skills. Then we have potential role models. They have the right attitude, but they're still learning the skill. And role models can be a powerful influence on mentoring potential role models. Then we have energy consumers. These are people who take the bulk of our energy, that have low skills and low attitude. And then we have people up here who are attitude challenged. They might have the skills, but they have the wrong attitude. We call those people competent jerks, right? We're wanting to be somewhat respectful. But anyway, what my argument is this, is usually people in this bottom left-hand quadrant, and often in the top left-hand quadrant, we are ill-fitted. It's a poor fit. And instead of trying to get the right attitude, what we need to work more on is getting the right fit. And if the fit isn't there, then we can help coach them to move on. But so often, and I always say, don't try to have people be accountable if there's a poor fit. If they're not in the right role, if they're not using their gifts and their passion, it's counterproductive, and it's a very poor investment of your time to try to build accountability when there's no passion. So many of you have seen this slide before. It's this ikigai that I show probably every presentation, that your gifts are aligned with your passion, aligned with your contribution, and that intersecting circle needs to be growing. And it's a lot easier to get accountability when people are using their gifts and their passion and making a contribution. It's a lot easier to foster accountability than if you try to foster accountability when it's out of people's gifts and passion and contribution. And you might be far better, rather than trying to straighten people out, you might be far better to help them move on and recognize there may be another place in the organization that's a better fit for them, or there may be another organization that's a better fit for them. But you'd be far better off than to try to make and push someone to be accountable when the passion isn't there. And as we say, fit people, don't fix people. You'll get a whole lot more leverage around accountability when you do that. And the last point is that I want to just talk about is attitudinal. How do we actually measure attitudes? And what we have to have in is what I call value conversations. Now, every organization, I hope everybody on this call has got a set of values. If you don't have a set of values in your organization, you're not going to be able to hold people accountable for their attitude. You're not going to hire for attitude, because you got to know what your values are. So I'm just going to say these are the 4 values that are emerging within our organization: character, compassion, courage, and contribution. Those are the 4 values that we stand for. Now, those values might sound sexy. They might sound good. They do to me anyway. I don't know if they sound sexy to anybody else, but they have no value at all until we turn those into accountable conversations, accountable value conversations. So how do we do that? Well, every value has to be accompanied by behavior. Now, by the way, I don't care what your values are. I could put any values up there, and the power in this is not in the values. The power is actually in the conversations. All values are opportunities to have conversations. So you turn those values into behaviors. Now, behavior, what does those behaviors mean? I'll just use Kristen as an example. If we use courage, what does courage mean to you here? What does it mean to me? And we really get clear about what courage needs to look like in this organization, what character needs to look like, what compassion needs to look like, what contribution needs to look like, to really hone in on getting clear. Now, we could list 2 or 3 behaviors, but there's no way that in a value statement with a list of behaviors that it would apply to everybody in your organization. This is something that is, and I've seen 20-page, if you can imagine, 20-page value statements, because we want to describe behaviors of every role in the organization. So what I'm suggesting is this has to be in a conversation. What does it mean to you? What does it mean to me? Now, this is now an expectation conversation. What do we expect from each other in living those values? And what will we agree to? Now, you could even add another piece to this, is how will we follow up? And how will we make sure that we're keeping each other's agreements? If you don't turn values statements into value conversations, they're useless as far as I'm concerned. In fact, they might even be worse, because you'll see all these values on the wall and you'll have people complaining because nobody's living the values around here, not because we're not living the values. And there's always gaps, which is a topic for another day. So this is the agreement process. Get really clear around operational expectations, around fit, and around attitude. Get clear about your agreements. Get clear about what you need for support. Get clear about consequences. And by the 3rd or 4th meeting, you might need to be talking about negative consequences. It's not going to work for you to work here, or you're not going to get a lot of freedom that you want. You're not going to get training opportunities. You're not going to be recognized in this culture if you don't come through on these agreements. And then how often do we need to meet to achieve that? So folks, that's my presentation. I want to again invite you to if you want to get into this stuff deeper, both on the engagement side and the relationship side and the leadership side, I would encourage you to research our academy. We'll talk more about it at the end of our Q&A period. And also we'll talk more about our SAGE forums and this work around peer mentoring programs for people who really need a community and want to stay together and want to hold each other accountable for this. We will be introducing you to this later on today. So feel free to put your questions in the chat room. I am now going to